All right. Now I hope you're seeing a green screen, right?
Success. Yep, that looks great.
Okay. What could possibly go wrong? So forgive me for ineptitude. So, excuse me, the last time we met was in January, and there has quite literally and figuratively been a lot of water under the bridge since then. So you guys are playing catch up. Uh, when I saw the names coming into the meet, I saw quite a lot of names I recognized, but a lot of you will be kind of being exposed to information that you haven't seen. Those people that I did recognize would be largely members of a group called the CDAG, the Community Design Action Group. Someone's going to correct me after. And we've had about maybe 6 meetings with that forum. So what you're seeing today is largely made up of their last meeting. So you're missing out on the first 5, but that's process. So you're seeing what we're doing, not what we're not doing. So without further ado, so the CDAG, so you're aware, a lot of the focus in that group has been about the east side span. There are 2 reasons for that. It's because irrespective of what happens on the east, largely the rest of the bridge is the same or similar. And also that the long span bridge is visually the most significant aspect. It will be the piece that defines if someone in later years says, "Oh, the Burnside," and everybody will say, "Yeah, the one with the," but the is yet to be determined. So we've done a lot of work, and there are still options on the table, and there is a process that will be explained to you about how to get your opinion on those. But I'm just going to take you through where we're at. So nothing has changed insofar as those 2 types generically are a cable-stayed bridge at top or a tide arch bridge at the bottom. I'm going to go into ideas of scale and all sorts of architectural niceties and not so niceties that go with that, but note the scale differential. I'll come back to it. So, I mean, this slide, I won't spend too long on this, but this slide was designed for that other forum that is inhabited by non-professionals and non-construction professionals, just to try and get some technical input into what is the difference between those 2 types. And they are very different. They do the same job, but they're very different pieces of structure. A cable-stayed bridge, it involves a singular point of structure, a tower, a mast, from which cables are strung to support a deck. That deck is in compression, the tower is in compression, cable stays are in tension. Conversely, a tide arch differentiates itself from a thrust arch, where in a thrust arch all the load goes down to ground. In a tide arch, a bowstring arch, that load is resolved through the deck. So it's literally like a bow. It's got an arch rib in compression and a deck in tension, and the deck is suspended between. So they have very different structural outcomes, and I guess the key takeaway is that the arches rest much more heavily on the in-water pier, whereas the tower, nearly all the load is going down terra firma. At least it would be if we had any terra firma. We have terra not very firma because it's obviously within the liquefaction zone of that side of the Willamette. So it's a deep foundation. So that said, I'm going to come back to this, but just so you know, I mean, those of you probably all very familiar with the site, but this is looking down, looking south on Second Avenue Southeast. Ignore the, if you can, ignore the large red arrow in the foreground, but the cable stayed tower will be somewhere in and around this 600 feet zone here, and the arches will be in and around this 570. The skate park's off to the left-hand side, and the just down to the right-hand side would be the Pacific Union Railroad and I-5 corridor. But within that hinterland, let's say, that's where the bridge lands on its east side. This is the AMR down here. I'll come back to it because there are some other iterations that are slightly longer, which is why it says longer arch. I'll show you those. So the generic types: cable stay, tied arch. The more specific types within those generic ones are labeled out here. I'll come back to it, I think, actually, to show you those in a little more detail, but there are 3 types of each, and essentially they're the same thing, but there's a great difference in profile, little difference in construction methodologies, and a little difference probably in cost, but these are all still very much on the table. So you have the goalpost tower on the top left. You have the same thing, but with those towers leaning out in the middle, and then you have an inverted Y configuration with the top of the tower over the center of the highway on the top right. And then the arches, in all 3 cases, the arches are on the outside of the deck, a pair of arches, either vertical with no bracing, through arches, leaning in with bracing, or vertical with bracing. Those are the generic typologies. I mentioned, excuse me, I'm going to go backwards. I mentioned earlier that last slide you saw. So the difference here, you can see that these are looking east. So you see that there's a pair of piers in these 2 scenarios. But these 2 types in particular, within the reachable cost range, could knock out this foreground pier and just have the pier just to the west of Second Avenue. So that red arrow on the earlier slide that I asked you to ignore, I hope you didn't, because that's what the longer ones land just shy of Second Avenue Southeast. Why does it matter? Well, it probably doesn't, but that 50 feet extra length of span equates, if you're using the same aspect ratio, to 20 feet additional height. And I'll show you later, but essentially there is a discussion about scale in the city, which you'll all be very much aware of. It's not to say we can't make the arches at any length 20 feet higher, but it's just that so happens to be what would happen if you lengthened it. Personally, I think there's not very much value in doing that. So here's some words. You probably use these words all the time. These words to the CDEG came with an explainer. That explainer probably complicated rather than simplified or clarified. But in essence, these are some, but perhaps not all, of the architectural and urban design discussions. I mean, there are other ones left and right of this page about cost, constructability, schedule, and so on, seismic resilience, etc., etc. But from a design perspective, these are some of the things that we're looking at, and the list is designed to do 2 things. One is to say it's not as simple as looking at 6 options and saying I like that one because they do not respond to all of these criteria in the same way. So some may have a more urbane response to some views, for example, whilst others might rise to the top in others. So there's a complexity within it. That it's kind of point one. The second point is that this list started life just to try and make my first point, but seems to have evolved into being one of the questions that is going in the online open house. So these words, which you will understand, it's my belief they are going to go in some respect to the public. So worth holding that in mind. So I won't run through all of those, but some of them are self-explanatory, but some of them need merit a little bit more to drill down into a little bit more. The first one, I've got a banner across the top, so I don't know what it says, even though I wrote it. It probably says height. Let me just see if I can move it. I can't. But this is about height. The red line, in really broad brush terms, says, okay, on that side, there is a 250 feet building ceiling, which is why the yard and MLK5 hover somewhere just below 250 feet. But that does not apply to structures. So we can bust it, but the question is, do we want to bust it? What is the value in doing that? Because this is a large structure, and it's a large structure not only in the city, absolutely on the pivotal spine of the city, so it will have an impact. And the very kind of analog analysis of this says, well, look, cable-stayed bridge towers are by definition taller. So we're looking at something like 290 feet above the ground, and about 130 feet for the arch. But if you add that 20 feet in for the longer version, maybe 150 feet. We're using that metric about above ground because rather than above a datum, because well, just to give you some kind of local context for these tall buildings that anchor the east of the site, but also to give you some context, height context. So the cable-stayed bridge, for example, at around 290 feet, and who knows, it might be 270, it might be 290, but there's an efficiency game to play. So the variation is about making it work in an optimal sense rather than an architectural want. But I'm kind of interested in the steel bridge very close by, 260 feet, 290 feet. So we're just poking our head above that particular parapet. I mean, you're familiar with all of those structures, and I suppose in psychological terms, the Tillicum would be the most comparable. That 180 feet, I think, is from the ground. So just as a comparator, we're a much taller structure because we're a much longer structure, but we have one tower only. Most cable-stayed bridges would have two towers, as the Tillicum does. So another differential is materiality, and this is essentially a given. So the cable-stayed tower will be a concrete construction, and all of the arch versions will be a weathering steel construction. Just to add in that the deck superstructure, the framing of the deck will also be weathering steel. So the arch versions are a kind of matching suit of weathering steel, and the cable stayed bridge will be a compendium of materials, but certainly that sort of standout piece in the tower will be concrete. And you'll all know that comes with baggage. It comes with a considerable onus on the weathering steel side to detail it to avoid rust spillage onto other surfaces. So waterproof detailing is hyper important. And on the lighting side, obviously weathering steel is a matte finish, so ambitions for architectural lighting need to be considered quite carefully, because the absorbency is higher, the reflectivity is much lower, and so on. Another differential, well, this is not between the cable stay and arch pieces per se, but it is between the subtypes. I don't know whether it's important to you. I don't actually know whether it's even important to me, but bridges are very, very constrained typology. The first thing we ever have to do on a project when someone says, this must be unique, then you have to gently explain that it's not going to happen, because there are only 6 bridge types and there are a limited number of subtypes within each of those 6 bridge types. So it's a limited pool. But of course, in the context of any city, what you're trying to do is make that be the best fit within the urban context. So do you want a unique structure in Portland is a credible question. Do you want a unique structure is not a credible question. I mean, obviously, the goalpost tower you already have. That's what the Tillicum is, albeit there are 2 sets of goalpost towers, but you already have one. You know what it looks like. The inverted, well, those appear to be, oh no, sorry. The labels on the diagrams are above, and confusingly, the photographs are labeled below, just to keep me on my toes. Yeah, so the V tower in the middle left, I mean, that's an increasingly common type. I think it's interesting. My own feeling about it is that it is perhaps more of an open water scenario than it is a city centre scenario, because it runs against the orthogonality of the building grain that just seems somehow not to be quite right to my eyes, but maybe maybe your eyes think differently. The inverted Y tower, well, there's not one of those anywhere near either. And so on and so on. So, but bottom right, obviously, within Multnomah County, you already have a recognizable bridge, so that is also a known entity, the Wapato Bridge. So, I don't think it's a major driver, but it's a kind of interesting nuance to say, well, look, we would like this to be something distinct from other bridges in the locality. So this, I think, is important. There's the two bridge types are spanning exactly the same, or within a few feet, they're spanning exactly the same length, and they're spanning the same obstacles. They're spanning the I-5, the railroad corridor, and connecting back into the land, and they're stretching out to reach the first in-water pier over the river. But you can see there on the left-hand side how very different they appear in the landscape. So this view, obviously, Burnside is on a bend in the river, and it straightens up as it goes to the north. So if you're looking south, from the centre of any of those bridges, from Fremont or from Broadway or from still, what you see is you see the cable stay bridge, bottom left. You see the tower over the land. You don't see the centre of the river bridge over the land. You see a land bridge. So that scenario really draws your eye eastwards, whereas the arch draws your eye westwards. So if you then concentrate on the two images on the right, the arch ribs reach in and connect very visibly, because the arch rib is a horizontal or albeit curvilinear form, and the cable stay is a vertical form that's recessed very far east, and the only thing that connects into the river is the cable plane. Those cables are very thin relative to an arch rib, for example, and they're very far apart. So they have legibility, but also transparency. So, I think it's quite important to consider whether you want the river bridge, as most of the other river bridges are, to have symmetry or pseudo-symmetry uninterrupted by what's happening east of it over the land. And what's happening over the land is this. So, to put my cards on the table, I would say I think the arch rib reaching into the in-water pier is a challenge visually, but it redeems itself as a type in this scenario. So I-5, so the images on the right are running north on I-5, and the images on the south are running down the on-ramp onto the southward highway. But you can see that the arch addresses the highway corridor. It says, "I am a bridge of the land," and okay, it reaches out over the river, but its sort of center of visual mass, its center of gravity is over the highway. And I think these images are taken a little high, but down from the driver's point of view, you have almost no cognition of the river in that position. You're just looking down the highway, and this bridge addresses that. I'm not saying that the cable stay doesn't, but it's a much more sort of subtle reaction to the highway. Whether, of course, that is the right place for a gateway structure, which the arch most certainly is, it is a debate. But my take on it is this: is that it's not a gateway from one place to another. It's a marker for what is the pivotal spine of Portland. So as you come under it, you can't fail but to notice that you're passing under the Broadway, the Burnside corridor. Well, interestingly, I don't know what that says at the top because I have a band in front of it, and I wasn't expecting to see this image, but I think maybe there's going to be a red line. Yes, here we go. Look at that beautiful red line. So one thing that this is a key issue rather than the differentiator between the types or the subtypes, but on all types, one thing that we're trying hard to achieve, and this, I must say, is in relative to the status quo when we arrived on the project, but we want to bind those three parts, the east longspan bridge, the river bridge, and the western approaches, together by continuity of deck edge. It's absolutely critical that edge is continuous and cohesive. It currently is, which I find very interesting. I mean, in modern bridges, what engineers, and with apologies to all the engineers on the call, bridge engineers tend to want to put the longitudinal structure as close to the edge as possible, and then have the cantilever as small as possible. But what that gives you is a very thick edge, a very thick visual component that defines the bridge. Whereas if you recess the longitudinal structure as far as you can back in and cantilever the footway, well, in our case, the bike and footway, you get a thin edge, and you do read the foreground edge much more. I mean, this isn't these aren't the best images to say what I'm about to say, but recessing the longitudinal structure into shadow is an immensely powerful device. So currently you have consistent framing end to end on the Burnside, and we aim to replicate that. There are another couple of things, as you can see down there on the bottom right. We have two operator houses on the south, one on the southeast, one on the southwest, either side of the moving bridge. And we have vessel protection on this side only. Both of those things on the existing bridge need to be replicated on the proposed bridge. We don't know what those are yet. I mean, we've designed our way around that particular debate very many times. So take these as placeholders. There will be something on the south side in front of the in-water piers that stops vessels hitting the bridge. It's a strange anomaly of well, certainly the language of bridge design, but also the attitude of mariners is that these are not to protect the bridge from the vessel, they're to protect the vessel from the bridge. So these are vessel protection. The other thing is here, what you don't see is the operator houses on the outside. We don't yet know whether they will be or whether they won't be, but our ambition is to take them inboard so that we can maintain the continuity of the deck edge, so the continuity of the framing with the cantilevered footway and the thin edge as opposed to the thick edge of a longitudinal structure, uninterrupted by the op houses. We'll see. So we are back to these types, which I described in rather scant detail previously. But I mean, 9/10 of bridge architecture is profile, and these all have a different profile. Well, they all have a different profile depending on where you're standing. So we have a relatively sophisticated CGI model. We are running currently some video of these types from those. Those are not ready yet, but they will form part of the online material. But what I can show you is these 6 options from various strategic viewpoints. You know, and you can make your own mind up what you think has power and what you think has, well, you know, whether the volume dial is turned up too high or too low on these particular options. So, you know, obviously the scale differential is the most immediate thing to notice, and perhaps actually the lack of difference from very many viewpoints of the arches. I mean, they are very similar. Whereas, you know, kicking a cable-stayed tower by a few degrees of inclination makes a significant difference to its demeanor. So this is a view that none of you will ever get, I'm guessing, but as an overview. I mean, one of the things to note on this, incidentally, is how the big pink sits just off of that corridor. And you know, one thing I quite like actually about cable stayed versions is that there is this conversation, this kind of bookending. You know, previously perhaps the Yarden MLP 5 would have done that bookending, but I think there is also a kind of interim conversation between the cable stayed towers and the big pink, which doesn't occur in the arch versions. So there is also a relatively unachievable view. There might be some buildings here, but unless your office window's there, you're not going to see it. But from this side of the town, and we'll drop down a little bit more to have a look at what it looks like. But you can start to see that, interestingly, it doesn't matter what you put on the east, or well, it does matter, but its significance is lesser than what's in the foreground, because by virtue of having these two bascule lifting decks, you have very significant in-water piers that define the foreground, and whatever you have in the background is relatively light, despite its scale. So this is from Tom McCall Waterfront Park. The bridge, obviously, in each case, spins off to the left-hand side across the park and into Old Town. I mean, there are, depending on your viewpoint, there are sort of scale from boring to exciting, or choose your own choose your own adjectives. Or perhaps it's a question of politeness in the urban context. I'll just leave that. I'll leave these up for slightly longer than I'll talk, because you need to take them in, but we can come back to them in a Q&A. There are 6 or 7, and we're only 3 or 4 from the end. So here we are at I-5 again. I've said, I think, all I need to say about the view or the difference between the cable stay and the arch versions, but perhaps I'll also point out to you that choose an arch, any arch, and they're largely indistinguishable from these profile views, whereas you do continue to notice the difference in the cable stay tower layouts. The same thing, looking in the other direction. I mean, interestingly, one would imagine that if you did a sort of head count on number of views or number of viewers, certainly this view is going to catch a significant proportion of the views of people experiencing this bridge in proximity. So now this is significant, I think. The first thing to note is that, of course, the arches suddenly look like they're bigger than the cable stays, but of course it's perspectival, because the cable stay is reaching towards you only with cables, and the main event is much further east. You have this scale illusion, whereas the arches are reaching out over your head, and they are both ride through experiences. Some of them are ride under experiences. Obviously, the two braced versions have cross structure over the deck, and the inverted Y tower, top right, also has portalizes the experience. So as you ride down, the statics don't quite show it, but the video will, is that you get this sort of moment of passing through the eye of the needle, one might say. But I'm also interested in this one about the relationship to the structure and this pair of buildings, the yard on the left, MLK5 on the right. So they do different things. the goalposts clearly frame it. I mean, the unbraced arches are effectively the arch version of the goalpost. They frame and reinforce that gap of the corridor. The V tower doesn't quite know what it's doing to that gap, but it just is existing in space and leaning into it. So it's creating a valley, which is not quite replicated by the buildings behind, but you experience that inclination or exclination of the tower also in the cables because they're leaning back in. And then these three, the braced arches and the inverted Y tower, are occupying the space. They're addressing the gap as opposed to framing it or ignoring it. I think that's the more successful scenario, personally. But again, they're not all equal in every facet. And then looking back, the reverse happens, of course, because the cable stay towers are much further east. So obviously, this part of the road is one way, so it's a kind of rear view, mirror view, or it's until you get about 10 blocks up, and then you're riding towards it. But it's also a crosswalk view, so all the vehicles cutting across, going north-south, will see it, and obviously all the pedestrians. Funnily enough, the arches pale into insignificance relative to the cable stay versions, but perhaps they are being respectful to the big pink and that conversation on that corridor, if one believes that is a necessary politeness. There's, from an architectural point of view, these two views, we think this is coming out more successful in the axial views. Of course, it's a highway bridge, but it's also a pedestrian and bike bridge on both sides, the north and the south. So this is on the south side path, looking east. Let me get my compass correct. It's not a divided path. At least only with striping. There's no barrier between the two. But in every case, in all of these, you can see that that path is outside of the main structure. So you're separated, at least on the east bridge, from the traffic, not only by a barrier but also by structure. And despite what I said earlier, it's extraordinary how a plane of cables that are very thin and very far apart still give you the impression of planar surface. You feel the separation, but it's still visually penetrable. But on both sides of the bridge, what you do have is an open edge. You've got nothing between you and the river, so it still is a riverside experience crossing the bridge, unless you're in a vehicle. And then in the other direction, looking west from the north side path, here's the Old Town sign, the big pink, obviously. I mean, very little to differentiate in terms of, the structures. They do what they do, but you're riding past rather than through in each case. And there is the last slide. I mean, I'm under some heat for not being, entirely fair by ending on what I would say was a preference, an architectural preference. But I had to end on something. I think it's rather a good image. But I'll tell you what's wrong with it. What's wrong with it is that these barriers, which are concrete, are not correct. Those will be open steel, three lines of structure, open, so have a much more airy, light feel. So I don't know how long I've taken. I don't know whether I've explained it well, but the floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Keith, for that presentation. Yeah, we've got about 15 minutes left, and we've got a few questions we can lead off with in discussion. Please do, if you have any, if you think of them, put them in the chat, and we'll get them on in the dialogue here. Fiona leads off a question about the design review process in addition to the C-Day. Does this go through City, Portland Design Commission, or other bodies of review? And then Megan.
Yeah, I can take that one. So the process is essentially we will be working through July to gather input and feedback from the public on this range. We will be taking that feedback back to our community design advisory group. They will consider that feedback as they make their recommendation on bridge type in August. We also will be sharing with that advisory group all the feedback we've heard in our briefing. So this is an example of a briefing, and we would take that feedback back to the group. And then the recommendation from the Community Design Advisory Group would go to the project team, which is taking in a number of, which is balancing a number of criteria as we march towards making a decision. So it's a mixture of community input on bridge aesthetics, cost, schedule, risk, impacts to stakeholders. So we'll be taking all that into consideration when we then make a recommendation to the Board of County Commissioners, and then ultimately the Board of County Commissioners will decide, and there is opportunity for public testimony at those board meetings. So I would say that's the process we have laid out in a nutshell.
Okay. Thank you, Megan. We've got a question. I think you started to address it in the slide. Keith, how much importance do you give to the experience in crossing the bridge to vehicular, bike, or foot? So the differences in modes. And the question is an anticipated animation with that view in mind?
Do you want me to take this one, Keith? Or
I do. I want you to do all the work from now on, James.
Okay, fair enough. So yeah, well, we are thinking about the experience for all bridge users, whether you're on the bus, in a car, on a bike, or as a pedestrian. And as Keith briefly explained, the experience as a pedestrian is going to be different from whether you are using the road corridor, because you have that physical separation between you and the river of the planes of cables or hangers for the archers if you're on the road, whereas the pedestrians and the cyclists are out with the structure, so they have much more open views out to the river and to the city. So the animations that are being undertaken at the moment will specifically show those differences and will run along the north and the south sides of the deck to kind of give you an idea of what it is that you will see and the experience that you will get when moving across the bridge.
Great, thanks, James. And those are going to be part of the survey, the online survey.
Correct. Yes, they
are. Continuing on, I think Megan, you had addressed this, but I think the question is if there's no center median planned. And I think a lot of it has to do with the cross-sectional demands of the bridge and the width and cost. I don't know if there's any specific follow-up on that.
Just that we want to make sure the deck is as flexible as possible for any future use, or sometimes when you do some temporary work, you need to close a lane and divert people to adjacent lanes. So having a barrier there would really limit that flexibility. So we just want to ensure that we're not encumbering any use of the bridge in the future.
Thanks. And then also following up on that was a different question, but thoughts about bridge lighting. It's a thematic element in our city. And is there any considerations? I know, Keith, you mentioned the different bridge surfaces are going to reflect or not reflect differently, but is that to come, or is there thoughts incorporated in the process so far?
So we are definitely going to be thinking about bridge lighting. As it stands at the moment, that process hasn't really begun, although having said that, we are thinking about how we integrate the lighting that we know will be there, the functional lighting on the bridge. So we know we're going to have light poles. They're not on these images yet, but they are in process. And one of the things that we're quite keen to do, Keith talked about the continuity of the deck edge. What we don't want to do is have light poles on bump outs on the outside of the bridge, because it's, for us, it's about the line of that trajectory of the outside of the bridge, and light poles will start to break that up. So we're trying to, we're keen to push the light poles into the median between the highway and the cycleway by making that curb slightly slightly wider. And what that will do is, when you look at the outside of the bridge, you will still get the continuous line of the deck edge, and it won't be interrupted by the light poles. So that's the functional lighting. But of course, this is potentially a monument for Portland, so it's got to look great after dark. And we've got lots of ideas how any of these bridges might be lit after dark. As Keith said, the weathering steel is going to be more of a challenge. Generally, with weathering steel, you're better off putting saturated color onto it for it to take up the light, or using white light just to make it glow orange. It doesn't take other colors, subtle colors, so well. Whereas concrete is much lighter gray. You can start to put colors on the concrete. One of the other things that we often do is, which might be relevant for the arches, is quite often good to light the inside of a structure, so that as you look at the bridge after dark, it almost turns itself inside out and reveals its spatial qualities to you, because you're looking through the plane of structure to what's beyond and inside the structure. So as I say, we've got lots of ideas, and we will be working with specialist lighting designers later this year, once the type selection process has been complete and we know what sort of bridge we're working with.
Great. Thanks, James. Speaking of things to come and consistency along the edge here, there's a question about ODOT required throw barrier. I think, where does it just moved? The security fencing above I-5. So we know that there's a minimum requirement for a fence over freeways. Has that been thought of, or where are we in the design process for that?
Yes, so that has now been thought of. So these images are probably a few weeks behind where the design process is. There is an increased fence above I-5 and across the railroad corridor. And again, that will now be shown in the animations. What we've done is we're trying to design a fencing system which leans out away from the pedestrians and then returns for a handrail. The advantage of that geometry is that that fence can then be as high or as tall as you need it to be to do its functional job without impeding into the space of the bridge deck. So watch this space. The animations will start to indicate those kinds of things.
Great, we'll look forward to that in the online presentation. There's a couple questions about piers. One, I think the first one is, within the 6 options, I think maybe Keith, you addressed this, that the piers all look the same. Is there flexibility for the design? And they seem really large. And the second one kind of complements that there are significant sort of presence in the architectural view of the bridge. How might those be resolved?
So I'm assuming we're talking about the in-water piers.
Sorry, yeah.
The shaping of all the piers is important to us. So the in-water bascule piers are a bit of a work in progress, in that we are still working with the bridge operators group to establish what is the requirement inside those piers and how the opening mechanism will be working. So what you see in the images is a placeholder, but that placeholder has roughly the right kind of size and mass of those in-water piers. But what it doesn't have is any subtlety to shaping yet. So in some of the other earlier renders you saw, you'll see that we, for example, took the arch rib from one of the arch options, and we continued the thrust line of that arch into a motif in the concrete, so that effectively your eye, not only can it follow the deck edge, but it could also follow up over the arch and down into the bascule pier. And those kind of things we will be looking at in detail as the design process moves on. We've got, at the moment, to give you an idea, we've got 3 or 4 parallel options going on, different layout arrangements for the operator houses, for example, and they all sit on different sized piers. What we didn't want to do at this point is have 3 or 4 pier options on top of 6 bridge options, because that would give us 24 piers to design. So we're kind of taking it one step at a time. It's important, and we will be addressing it. But at this point in the design process, it's about the type selection of this long span east approach. I hope that answers the question.
I think, yeah, it's in process, but you did segue into perhaps the next question. How long do we anticipate the timeline for the design to be? I guess part of that question is when will we get to a type that we can get into final approval so that the engineering, the technical design can continue towards construction?
So the technical design is ongoing on all of these options. So everything you're seeing here is sized. So for example, the bottom left, the unbraced arch is actually 9 feet wide. It's a subtlety that you probably don't pick up from the renders relative to the 4 feet arch ribs on the braced arches. They can be much narrower because they're braced, but all of that is factored into these images. So the animation, the information, the imagery that we put forward to the public will be as accurate as it can be in terms of the engineering. We're expecting some sort of guidance from the CDAG group following that public consultation in late August, and others on the call can correct me if I'm wrong. And thereafter, we're making a recommendation to the county as to the type for the long span east approach. Once we have a type, then we can start working on the details and start working in the shaping of the structural members and all those kinds of important details.
And maybe I'll just double back on the type timeline. I don't know if Megan or others, when do we estimate the anticipated sort of final type selection to occur?
So we plan to make a decision in, bring the decision recommendations to the board in October.
Okay. Thank you. Some of these, I think here's a good one. You talked a little bit, Keith, in your presentation that we do have Tilikum Crossing as a cable stayed bridge. There's a question about what's the perspective of the 2 different tower types. If we have 2 bridges that are similar, is there a perspective or opinion about that, and can they be seen from one another?
Well, they are similar in terms of type, but of course the Tilikum is 2 towers, well actually 4 towers over the water, whereas we're proposing half of that over the land. We haven't done an analysis to see if you can see them from each other, but I guess it's really a question about whether we want some sort of harmony going between those 2 particular bridges, or whether we want something which is more unique, and whether the Burnside should make its own statement and react to its own site and the particular constraints that it has and that it overcomes.
But more about a city context relationship than maybe one from another. And then we got 2 more questions. I think, Steve, you may have started to answer this one about the bridge height over the water, but there's a question about the tides and if that's been considered and if the fluctuation is big enough to recognizable.
Yeah. We have been considering tidal influences, but more significantly, the flood elevation, 20-year, 50-year, 100-year, that really affects the design as being considered and is frankly overwhelmingly greater than the tidal effects. So we are embedding into that process. The scale of those in-water piers has a direct effect on the hydraulic impacts that we're having, and so there is a constraint around sizing to avoid a water surface rise for the various flood events. So all of that is in consideration as we're going through these steps.
I remember the 96 flood and walking out towards the steel bridge and the floating logs hitting the bottom of the steel bridge. So yeah, that's a big deal. Lastly, I think we have maybe a moment for one question. It's 1 o'clock, so if you have to leave, please do. But the question here is about the control towers. It says bridge operations. Can the control of the bridge be handled via cameras remotely instead of having manned control towers as part of the design? And I guess with the bridge lift, are they required?
I can speak to that. So whenever we open the bridge, we always have operators on site. So while you may not see operators there every day, we get call outs in advance and we can staff the bridge accordingly. And then the Hawthorne Bridge is always staffed 24/7. And while you can operate the bridge remotely using cameras, we do find that in Portland, it's just safer for the public if we have someone who's there on site and can have eyes on the traveling public. There's a lot of situations where people don't really follow the rules, so it's just really great to have someone there to say, hey, could you please get off the bridge or continue on? It's just overall a safety priority to have someone there when we operate the bridge.
Thank you. And there was a question about the seismic design in terms of its capability. This is Earthquake Ready Burnside Bridge, so I think that's the front and foremost purpose of the bridge, is to be around in a potentially cataclysmic seismic event. So I don't know if there's more to address or if that's on the website, but I do want to, Steve, you took your off mute. Do you want to?
I'll give you a 30-second answer. There's designed for 2 kind of big seismic events: the Cascadia subduction zone, which is what we're considering the lower level, the smaller earthquake, and then a 1,000-year return period earthquake, which is larger, which includes an even greater Cascadia subduction zone or a local crustal event that's closer to Portland. So 2 types of earthquakes that we're considering, 2 levels with different operating standards for each.
Great, thank you. Well, I appreciate the design team, Steve, Megan, James, and Keith. Thank you for a great presentation. Again, there's a reminder that there's an online open house starting in 1st of July. It'll be going for a month. Please do tune into that. And I know the Burnside Bridge, Earthquake Ready Burnside Bridge website will have information about that, and we'll try to share it if we can as it comes online as well. So thank you all for your time. Appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day, and we look forward to the next stage of the design process.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.